So Boris Cherny, the guy who actually built Claude Code, just dropped his latest tips and tricks on how to get the most out of it. And given that it's gotten more than 1 million views in the last 24 hours, I went through each and every feature that he mentioned. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through 15 different features that you may or may not know how to use or not use to the full potential. But I'm not just going to conceptually walk you through these concepts, but actually show you how you can practically apply them. So if you watch this video till the end, you'll be one step closer to mastering Claude Code. Let's get into it. So from these 15 core features and concepts, I'm going to breeze past the ones that are pretty straightforward and double click into the ones that are a little bit more nuanced. So many of you might know you can access Claude Code on your phone, but most people don't know that they're constantly trying to achieve feature parity. So eventually you can run the majority of Claude Code using a terminal through the Claude Code app. And despite building my own personal assistant I called Claude Claw that I showed on this channel a few weeks ago, I still use the Claude Code app on my mobile because it's helpful to see things like Bash, the actual code executions. If you're using something like an OpenClaw or something derivative of that, if you can't see what's happening and you're doing very code intensive tasks, even if you're not the one coding, then you're missing out on some of the transparency. A couple key things to note is that to make the use of this app, then you'd want to create a GitHub repository that you log into so that all your code lives in one place. So you can push it from one end and then pull it from the other. And when it comes to clicking on this code tab at the bottom left-hand side of the mobile, you can actually go and click on plan mode. So you can do a lot of the planning on the go and maybe push that planning to your GitHub repo, then pull that from an existing session on your desktop and continue executing from there. So tip number 2 is one thing that I have underused greatly, which is teleport. And the whole point of teleport is that you can have an existing unsaved session on your Claude Code on your app that you can just resume from a desktop computer. So let's say I executed this prompt from my mobile device and I just said read the following website and make the changes to the hero section, make sure you have a better call to action, etc. Let's say I am resuming this session and I'm getting home and I want to hop onto my laptop. All I have to do is nothing from the app itself. I just have to go and write Claude -- teleport and it will be able to look at my existing sessions in the cloud. And you can see right here, 2 minutes ago, update hero section for spring promotion. And if we do enter right here, we'll be able to go through, and this was the exact conversation that we had on the mobile device. Now tip 3 is very much related to teleport, but instead of going from your mobile device to your desktop, you can go from your desktop to your mobile device. So how you would do that is if you go to your terminal and you do /remote control, this is another feature that I discounted, but now that I understand where and when to use different types of tools, like when to use dispatch, when to use remote control, when to use my own configuration on my Telegram, now I understand that when it comes to monitoring a task that's a little heavier, that you want to be able to navigate and see what are all the logs and the details happening right now, remote control is an awesome way to take an existing terminal where all you want to do is narrowly focus on that task and have it on the go. But one additional nugget from Boris is beyond remote control on its own, you can actually put in quotes the name of the session. Because usually, if I pull up my mobile phone right here, you can see that some of these are basically the name of the task or the first thing that's being asked of that chat. So if I move my phone to the right for a second, you'll see that right here, I've called this session website redesign, and we have the exact same thing popping up on mobile. Otherwise, we'd get confused. Let's say you had 5 or 6 different remote control sessions. Now you can name each one something you can always remember, especially if you're busy on the go. Now the next tip is definitely more powerful, and this is how Boris and his team runs Claude Code on what's called autopilot mode, where they take advantage of 2 newer features. One of them is called /loop, and the other is called /schedule. The core difference is /loop works as long as your terminal session and your computer is on, whereas schedule can be written in the cloud and executed in the cloud. But the core idea is this: you can execute some form of request like check my inbox, and then every 5, 10, 30 minutes, you just allocate what is the time interval to re-execute said task. So Boris is using it to babysit his code, in his own words, every 5-10 minutes. So if we pop into the terminal, let's say we have a series of hypothetical files here. So we have brand assets, we have client documents, we have proposals, we have reports, we have templates. All of them kind of feed into this demo. And let's say our first prompt was the following: read through all the client folders in clients and give me a quick summary where each project stands. So this will walk through, and then we can do the following. For this one, we could do /loop, and right after /loop, the syntax is to put the time interval as to when it should execute. Check my email inbox. Draft professional responses for anything that needs a reply. Save drafts, but don't send anything. And if we execute this, now this will naturally try to invoke a series of skills on my computer, but so long as this terminal session and my computer are open, it should be able to go on this autopilot mode. And you can see right here, it invokes something called cron create. This will go and execute this every 30 minutes, like we mentioned. This is the job ID, this is the interval, this is the task, and this is when it auto expires unless you cancel it sooner. Now next up are one of my favorite features of Claude Code and the ones that I mainly teach in all the workshops we do at different companies, which are hooks. And if you still don't understand the concept of hooks, you can think of it as a series of rules that automatically fire based on an event. If you want it layman's terms, then imagine you have your phone. Let's say you have an iPhone, and before you go to bed, it automatically goes into sleep mode or do not disturb. Technically, that's a hook. That's a hook based on a time. Let's say 10 p.m. is your bedtime or 11:30. Then that would fire and then execute your phone to not have notifications during that sleeping time. And then in the morning, when you wake up and it sees that you're actually using your phone, you're sending messages, it asks you, do you want me to remove this mode and go into the normal mode where we turn off your alarm and everything else is just normal? Hooks work in exactly the same way. So you can attach a hook to a session start, before any particular action or tool use, or after a tool is used, after any or every edit, or after a session even ends. So you have so many checkpoints where you can attach a hook. So one example of a practical use case of a hook is most people rely on something like a Claude MD file to auto-inject all of their preferences. And you can use it to say, always learn and understand our brand guidelines before we create any new asset. But another way you can do this is to attach a hook. And the way you can attach it is say, set up a hook so that every time I start a new session in this project, you automatically read the brand guidelines. So you're forcing the tool calls of Claude Code to read this and have it in context each and every time. And then you can also do the following, where you tag the Claude Code Guide agent. This is my favorite thing to do from a syntax standpoint, because at the end of the day, a hook is just a series of code in what's called a JSON file. It's called a settings.json file. In case you don't want to get your hands dirty, you're non-technical, then you can tag this specific agent and it will help you do it with the best syntax. And you can see it writes this hook to your settings file directly, and then the next time you have a session start, then it should be able to fire said hook and make sure that it auto-injects the same document every single time. And the core difference between this versus relying on Claude Code with Claude MD is that this is deterministic. This will get shoved into that context window whether Claude Code wants it or not. Now the next one is very straightforward, and it's something you probably have heard of because there was so much coverage about it, which is Cowork Dispatch. And it's essentially the quote-unquote open claw killer, wink wink, nudge nudge, more so for enterprise and SMBs where they don't want to get their hands dirty, and all they want is an experience of having remote control access to your desktop. So the way you set it up is unbelievably straightforward. All you have to do is download the Claude Code desktop app, and then once you navigate to Dispatch right here, you'll be able to whitelist a series of access requests. And once you whitelist everything that's needed, you can always toggle on things like keep awake and enable computer use. And beyond that, initially, I was confused where to derive the most value out of this. And yesterday, I was battle testing a Chrome extension that I built for my community, and I realized that if you use something like Claude in Chrome, let's say we actually go into Chrome, and this is the Chrome extension I put together, it couldn't actually physically click on the extension and execute requests. I had to basically click on it myself or have it go and access things through the network tab, because Claude in Chrome can access everything within the browser right here. But using Claude Dispatch, now technically it could take control of my computer in full, then open the browser, then physically click on this. So if I ever wanted it to actually reload the extension and keep testing itself, I would need to use something like a dispatch to physically take control of every single part of my browser. Now there are probably even more use cases than this, but this is an example of one that I found actually useful. Now, the next one is something that I personally use every single day when it comes to validating anything that needs a visual inspection layer. So instead of just checking whatever Claude Code builds yourself on, let's say, localhost or an HTML for a website, you can just tell it recursively. Go and use the MCP Claude in Chrome to go and review your settings and review anything that you built and make sure that it lines up with our requirements or our specifications. So the analogy here is, would you trust a chef who can't taste their own food? So the goal is you have Claude Code right, it will then visually inspect its own creation, and then once it checks it through the Claude in Chrome extension, all you have to do is download this and then log in through your Claude Code account. Then you have a very systematic process where Claude Code writes the code, then repeats until it thinks it matches the requirements. Then it can actually go and check it and see the result, fix any issues, and go into this recursive loop where typically it's not endless. Claude Code is somewhat arrogant where sometimes it will think that it's done, but it's done the 80 of the 80-20. So you might pop in and say, you tested 8 out of 10 things, but you didn't actually test it deeply. I want you to take this specific user journey, or assume that someone's clicking into each and every nook and cranny of our app, go and battle test that yourself. And one extra bonus nugget here is if you want to make sure you're always enabling Claude in Chrome, as well as a series of other things, you could do /config. Once you do that, you will see all of these settings and whether or not they are set to true. Whether you want to do auto compaction in your sessions, whether you want to be able to go into thinking mode by default, everything. And if you go to the very bottom here, you will see things at the very, very bottom, like enable control for all sessions, as well as Claude in Chrome enabled by default. So you'll see here, I have it set to true. So whenever it makes logical sense for it to invoke and use said tool, then it always will. Whereas with something like enable remote control, right now I have this on default. So if I set it to true, then every single session, technically, that I spin up will be something that I'll be able to port into my Claude mobile phone. Now, one expert tip on this from yours truly is that if you have multiple skills or MCP servers that know how to use browsers in different ways, and there could be some overlap on which one fires when you ask for a task that involves this, you can call it out specifically. So you can say, use Claude in Chrome for a very particular task, and then it will know 100% of the time to use it. And I find it personally useful for logging into pre-authenticated apps or services. So if I wanted to log into my Gmail and you use, let's say, agent browser skill from Vercel, you'd have to physically go into the new browser it spins up, authenticate yourself every single time, and then that adds some more burden. So Claude in Chrome is great for quick and dirty because it's using your actual browser, just creating a separate group within it. So the next feature is also very straightforward, and it's also back in the Claude desktop app. And instead of Claude Cowork or Claude Code, this one works primarily in Claude Chat, where you have a chat on the left-hand side, and instead of just giving you some form of HTML file for you to render on your own, you can actually get a preview. So if we pop into the Claude desktop app, you'll see here I've asked for a brand new landing page, and instead of just cranking out a file, then we can actually click on this sidebar right here. When we click on the sidebar, we can click on this file. We'll be able to get a live preview of the site. And the cool thing is, given the name, live preview, as you're making changes, you can actually see it changing in real time. So if you want the light version of seeing everything, and you don't feel like opening up Claude Code, asking it to spin up a local host on your computer, then to preview it, and you just want to draft something, then this is an amazing way with the path of least resistance. Next up is a feature that I've also reviewed on this channel called /branch, and it comes very handy when you have a literal fork in the road where you want to decide, do I go path A or path B? But you don't want to risk path A in case that is the right path. But you feel like physically side questing to investigate an additional idea or a different take. So to put this into action, let's say I have the following prompt. And I say something like, I need your help to refine a proposal for a specific client. And these are the addresses of the files. I break down what the situation is to give it context. I tell it exactly what I want the proposal to look like for what denomination, and a series of criteria here on how it should rewrite it. So let's assume it executed that. Now I ran this before this video just so that you wouldn't have to watch me watch Claude Code crank it out. And let's assume we get some version. And this goes through the current state of things. But let's say I want to experiment with really aggressive pricing. But I don't want to flood that in my context window and have the language model start getting confused between our current rate versus this very aggressive, different possible reality. So in order for us to side quest, we could do something like branch, very aggressive pricing versions. So now we're in a separate branch where I can ask for the exact same proposals with very different structures of pricing. And the good part of this is, if I review this and it looks like this is the way to go, I can now purely go down this path and leave our old conversation in a way where, as you can see here, we can always resume it by entering Claude-R with this ID in any terminal. Now the next one is the simple, useful, and very applicable /by the way, and this one doesn't need too much information. All we have to do is enter some form of prompt, and while said prompt is executing, we can just do /by the way, what are our numbers for Q1? And then this allows us to multitask in a way where we're not flooding the context window of the main session, and we can just get all the information as we go. We can click on space and keep the conversation flowing as we need it to. Now this next tip is typically one that non-technical people run away from because it sounds very intimidating. But conceptually, it's actually unbelievably simple, which are using work trees and how to actually invoke them. Now, work trees, if the analogy of a tree isn't helpful, you can think of it as having 3 separate desks with 3 separate agents with 3 separate types of work and documents. The goal is each one can actually work mutually exclusively without having a risk that multiple agents are working on the exact same file or trying to edit or write to the same file at the same time. So if we think of it as different lanes with different desks, with different agents and different work, then lane 1 could be writing the client proposal, lane 2 could be website redesign, and lane 3 could be financial reporting, where all of these files shouldn't have any form of overlap. Now, one thing to talk about it and another thing to show it. So the syntax is the following. You would write Claude. You don't need this part. I'm just running this in YOLO mode. And then you do -W. This stands for work tree. This tells Claude that you are executing a separate desk with a separate set of work. And in this case, we're just basically assigning it what this work tree is about. So in this case, it's about proposal for Acme Company. And beyond that, there's really not much to it. You just prompt as you normally would. So in this case, I would just say, write a revised proposal for Acme Corp based on their project notes in this folder. They're now in phase 2. Propose an upsell to enterprise tier for phase 3. And again, exact same concept for another task. So you'd enter the exact same syntax right here. You do the -W for a brand new desk, work tree, whatever concept makes sense. And now you have a separate lane called website update. And this will be designated to adding testimonials to your website at the very bottom using real client names from our client folder. And then while this is running, you can also run this one, which is -W quarterly report. Read the reports from this folder and create a professional Q1 board report that looks at X, Y, and Z, and then execute it. So if you've historically been intimidated by this concept, be intimidated no more. Really easy to execute and very useful. So this next step should be taken with a gigantic grain of salt and a lot of caution, especially if you're very token conscious of your rate limits and everything that's now happening with all these different usage capacities. So if work trees can spin up 3 Claudes at once at different desks, technically, batch can spin up 5, 10, 15, 30 at once. So /batch has a higher emphasis on breadth of execution versus depth and thoughtfulness of how to derive the most of each singular agent. So the way it works is if we pop into the terminal, you can open a session and do the following. Do /batch, then after batch, you have to enter some form of request. So you could say update the hourly rate from 150 to 175 across all proposal files in the proposals folder, keep existing formatting, recalculate all line items, totals, and the grand total in each proposal. So if we send this over, I will show you what happens. So now it enters plan mode, and in plan mode, it researches and sees basically what is the scope of this task. So now it's going through each and every possible proposal that we have in our workspace. Once it finishes its plan, it goes through and it breaks down all the context, all the formatting conventions that need to change, what's going to change in each and every proposal. So it has a draft of that. And then at the very bottom, it walks through the worker instructions template. Each worker that it will spin up receives the specific file, the exact old to new values for each line item, and the new grand total. So now, if you go onto YOLO mode and execute it, it will employ as many agents as it wants, as if it's venture capital funded, and it can hire whoever, whenever, to execute the task. So if you are rich in tokens, feel free to go for this. But if you are erring on the side of caution, you're being frugal, I would avoid this comma for now. Now the next recommendation is one that I barely use, and I don't really see many use cases, at least for myself, to use, but just in case it's useful for you, it's basically adding what's called --bear. And --bear will allow you to run a command without having Claude always inject the Claude MD, the skills, all of the additional burden and bloat that comes into each and every session. When you add --bear, it will circumvent all of that and just execute the request you have in seconds. So just in case you thought I meant bear the animal, you would actually write it Claude --bear and then execute some form of command. Now one thing I noticed in trying to use this myself is if you're using your normal Max account or your subscription, then running this won't work because it says not logged in. So it appears, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know otherwise in the comments, but you have to use this via an API request, and then once you have the API, then you should be able to run it. So I tried multiple different ways to log in, exit my own terminal, but the core idea is you would send something like this. So this is a shortcut that does work, that's -p, and you ask the question and you get the answer immediately. But if you use this -p alone without the --bear, you're not getting technically the benefits of not having any form of bloat or burden in the conversation. So you might have a use case on your end where this makes sense, but for myself, I'm okay with having the Claude MD loaded in for a basic question versus having to wrangle this myself. For the penultimate tip, this one's also very straightforward. This is purely a syntax play. So instead of just giving Claude Code access to one singular project, you can also give it one basic command, I'll show you right now, that will allow it to also shop different projects and different resources in those projects. So if we pop into the terminal and you write something like Claude, and then you say --add-dir, in this case add directory, and then templates, and then I do another one which is adding brand assets, I'm technically adding multiple different directories within my session. So that's where all of these come from, where I added the templates folder right here, as well as the brand assets. These were external for my project, but now with this command, I'm bringing them into context. And the last core tip was being able to call an agent by name at the very beginning of your Claude Code session. So instead of starting a Claude Code session, then asking Claude to go and remember how to use a specific agent, you start the session with the agent already injected in context. So if that doesn't make sense, you basically start a session with your agent already auto-injected with all the personalities, the quirks, the rules, the regulations, and the tools that it has access to. So if you watch my last video, I spoke at length at the power of this .claude folder and every permutation and everything inside that makes it tick. One of the things that makes it tick is this agents folder, where you can write a markdown file, and whatever the name of the markdown file is technically the name of the agent. So if I take a click on this, this is the name, which is called proposal writer, this is the description, and these are the tools that this agent can invoke. So if we go down, these are the structure of the commands, and you can start a session by saying Claude --agent proposal writer. So you can have it by name, and when it loads it up and you say something like write a proposal for Tech Corp, it will execute this entire structure using all the rules and the paradigms and the description with this specific agent. Now I know that was a lot, but I did my best to be as concise as I possibly could to show you the concept as well as the application. And don't worry if you want to be able to access all of the different prompts that I showed you, the demos, the actual shortcut commands, I'll make those all available to you in the second link in the description below. And if you found this video helpful and you learned something, then I'd super appreciate if you left a like, a comment, and a sub on the channel. It really means a lot to me and it really helps me grow the channel. And to anyone else that wants to go much deeper into Claude Code and be in a community with tons of folks, tons of coaches, my own wisdom, and exclusive content, then check out the first link in the description below, and maybe I'll see you in my early adopters community. I'll see you in the next one.